Hi, my name is Stephanie White. I have been working for GCFSI for about a year and a half. I got my PhD from the Community Sustainability Department here at MSU, and I did my research on urban agriculture in Senegal. The first thing I want to do in my presentation today is I want to clarify where I'm coming from with the research by explaining the research frame. And then I want to talk about some of the broad themes that are of concern, and I will close by talking about the research that we did in Malawi last summer. So first of all, I want to make a distinction between the urbanization of food systems and urban or city food systems. Many of you are aware of this broad trend of urbanization throughout the world, which means that moving forward, proportionally more people will be living in cities than in rural areas, and portends changing economic and social environments, including how and what people eat and grow. So some of the projections include that people will eat more meat and there will be more processed foods, and that this urbanization of food systems will require responses to accommodate this demand. So when there is a focus on urbanization writ large, the level of inquiry and intervention tends to be at a higher level and is guided by projections of demand that are thought to accompany urbanization, no matter where this urbanization is occurring. It's presented as sort of this universal trend, this universal and historical, or just a universal trend. So, as the term is used, you could say that the U.S. food system is entirely urbanized, even in rural areas. So, this urbanization dynamic is often said to have a similar effect on food systems no matter where they are. It's not limited to the urban space. And in the sense that it's used, people are really talking about a westernization of food systems, and I think that is probably more accurate than the term urbanization, since the qualitative shift in diets really has to do with eating more meats and processed foods, which is reflective of a Western diet. In contrast, my research interests are focused on food exchange and provisioning in cities as it's happening. And I'm more concerned with urban food realities and understanding food exchange and provisioning in relation to livelihood and food security, as well as in relation to some of the major challenges we face as a planet, like resource scarcity, climate change, and growing inequality. And those are the things that the urbanization of food systems work and the nutrition transition work does not necessarily focus on. And because food exchange and provisioning is arranged very differently throughout the global South, this means that much of my research has a strong ethnographic component to it. And I'm really just more interested in understanding the characteristics, needs, and value of what is widely known of the informal or traditional food sector, especially in relation to contemporary social, economic, and political dynamics, and as well as environmental dynamics. So, to fully consider food exchange and provisioning in the context of the world we live in and the challenges we face, like obesity, climate change, and inequality, we have to move beyond thinking about just demand. And we need to recognize that eating practices are influenced by, as well as influence, the environments, the social and ecological environments that we live in. The way that we organize our food systems has a lot of implications for our health and our environment, whether we deliberately recognize them or not. But deliberately recognizing and accounting for them is important to being able to manage for them. In other words, what gets measured gets managed. I take that from one of my ecological economics class that I took when I was doing my PhD studies. So I've come up with an acronym here that captures some of the other dimensions that are important for maintaining and building good food systems. Food systems should be sustainable, healthy, appropriate, resilient, and equitable. A sustainable food system. That sustainability refers to the ability of a food system to meet our current food needs without compromising the ability of the system to meet the food needs of future generations. Sustainability is often defined with characteristics such as resource efficiency, that it promotes environmental and economic well-being, and sometimes this idea that it's regenerative is included. A healthy food source is one that is both nutritious and safe, which supports physical and mental health, and which accounts for public health impacts across the entire life cycle of how food is produced, processed, packaged, labeled, distributed, marketed, consumed, and disposed. That's all aspects of the food system. So looking at urban food security in terms of healthiness would of course look at the diversity of food that is available and accessible, as well as the conditions under which food is exchanged and produced. And you can see by looking, for example, at the U.S. food system, that we often just focus we focus on the consumer. We focus on what the consumer is doing and sort of put all of our interventions at the consumer level. But if we were really talking about health and well-being across the food system, we would also consider the conditions, for example, under which people are harvesting the food. The conditions that are created by such a high demand for meat, for example, that there have been a couple of good articles recently in the media that have talked about how tomato farming in Florida, for example, causes a lot of health problems with people who work in the fields, or how workers in Mexico are really exposed to a lot of pesticides and damaging chemicals in the work that they do in the fields, with minimal access to protective equipment or to doctors. So appropriate here is resonant of the idea of appropriate technology movement, but addresses the idea that interventions and planning in food systems should be relevant to the daily lived realities in food environments in particular places. So necessarily what this means is that food planning should proceed through collaborative planning approaches and in relation to existing constraints and opportunities. In much of the Global South, food exchange and provisioning is highly decentralized, and so a lot more people are involved in food-related livelihoods, and will be affected by the policies that affect the food system. We'll just move to the next one. All right, so resilient refers to the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change, so that it still retains essentially the same function, structure, identity, and feedbacks. A key aspect of resilience is adaptability, which refers to the capacity of humans in the system to manage for resilience. The concepts of resilience and adaptability require us to look at all the relationships that comprise food systems in the context of the wider environment, and to consider how human food practices are likely to hold up under adverse conditions. One of the papers I did for my dissertation, for example, talked about how people manage for resilience when the food system is widely distributed. There are more opportunities in different ways that people can create access to food. So I suggested this is what this figure represents is all the different aspects of how people access food in the urban environment. People use rural to urban transfers. They use their open air markets, which contain small to medium retail. There are supermarkets, which are less popular with many people. Sometimes food is exchanged via social obligation or other social relationships. There's street food. There's wild harvesting still in many cities. And then there's urban agriculture. And I looked at how urban agriculture could be more fully understood by looking at it in the context of this wider food provisioning system. In much of the Global South, urban food systems are emergent and have developed in association with the city. And people provision their households based on their various capacities and opportunities, and choose from a variety of strategies. and they usually use a mix of market and non-market sources. So individual households and people have to navigate their various constraints and scarcities, and so everybody develops multiple ways of accessing food. Scarcity and instability are likely to remain key features affecting food systems and food provisioning efforts, so it makes sense to more fully consider the ways in which people manage for resilience. And going back to the idea of adaptive capacity, and having multiple sources of food is an adaptive practice that increases resiliency in the social, economic, and environmental context of the city. Okay, so to get this multidisciplinary perspective that considers all these different aspects of food systems and how people provision their households, it's necessary to use both qualitative and quantitative approaches that consider space, socioeconomics, resource use and access, livelihood, culture and infrastructure, and then you need to be able to understand how these things interact and how do they affect the ways in which people experience food security and nutrition in their own lives. One way we begin to look at urban food systems at GCFSI is through research on small to medium scale legume trade in Lilongwe, which we conducted last summer. And in this sense, on the one hand, we were looking specifically at pigeon pea and other multi-purpose legumes to have a better understanding about what was going on in relation to that, in relation to those legumes specifically, in terms of how they were moved around, what the demand was, the constraints that people experienced in trying to access them or store them. But in another respect, it served as an entry point into the wider food system, just so we could get an idea about the food marketing environment in Lilongwe. The research is part of a larger research effort. The research that we did specifically in relation to urban markets was part of a larger research effort that sought to ask this question here. From a number of different entry points and research perspectives. The sort of umbrella question, is where and how can multi-purpose legumes be scaled for sustainable intensification of maize systems, and what would the potential impact be in the medium term across the food system in Malawi? Much of the work that has been conducted on legumes has taken place in rural areas in the context of production, but recognizing that urban areas are important to what farmers produce, we wanted to better understand the existing status or demand environment of pigeon pea in the Lilongwe markets, as well as the opportunities and constraints experienced by urban legume retailers. Specifically, the research is intended to provide a better understanding of how strategic investments could support improvements in legume trading networks, so urban retail markets are better able to meet urban legume demand now and as urban populations grow, and the urban market environment in order to benefit the livelihoods of small to medium scale retailers. The research that we conducted with our team was heavily qualitative, and it relied on interviews, pretty lengthy interviews about what people sell and how they obtain them, what difficulties they face and how they address those difficulties. The data was collected by 4 graduates of Luanar over a period of about 8 days, and the interviews were conducted in Chichewa in 21 markets in and around Lilongwe. Then the interviews were transcribed into English, and I coded them using InVivo, which is a qualitative data analysis software. While we were there, we also spoke to a representative from the Lilongwe municipal government who told us about their plans to upgrade markets. So the idea here is that the information we collect and analyze could be used not only to better understand what's going on with legumes, like I said, but also informing municipalities about how to invest scarce resources into improving the conditions in markets, which in turn can have an impact on food security and income. So I'm just going to give you a couple examples in terms of our findings. And so, for example, the kind of information that might be important for a municipality would be to know that many urban legume retailers face major constraints in relation to storage. Losses of their product while in storage was one of the main problems that affected livelihood for legume retailers and could represent an important area of investment for municipalities. And just talk about and you can see that a lot of people said that they had no problem, but it's important to understand how retailers manage risk and then think about how that may affect livelihood. For example, one way to manage the risk posed by inadequate storage is to only buy small amounts. That meant, for example, that many had to take lots of trips to acquire beans, which is expensive, and perhaps better storage would allow people to acquire larger amounts and have to travel less often. Another surprising finding concerned the availability of pigeon pea in the Lilongwe markets. The conventional wisdom is that pigeon pea is a legume of the South and that it's not widely available or even consumed in the Lilongwe. However, our team found that, and as well as the gender specialist who was conducting research, found that there was a wider availability of pigeon pea than expected in the Lilongwe markets, and that some retailers even had trouble keeping up with demand. And this kind of data does not appear in larger data sets like the Integrated Household Survey. It really takes being in markets and talking with the actual the actual legume retailers to understand what's going on with demand. And that can also help to target investments to increase the pull factors for pigeon pea, which can then be conveyed hopefully to farmers. Okay, and then a last example of a finding is we asked legume sellers how much they depend on legumes for their main form of livelihood. And this sort of begins to contribute to a research agenda that better understands urban food-based livelihoods, about which very little is known. And in general, very little is known about how people make their livelihoods in urban places. And as cities grow and as municipalities have to make decisions about where to focus their resources, it's really important for them to get a sense of how people earn income. Here, this is divided out by male and female and the extent to which legume sales contribute to the livelihoods of men and women. The purple represents the majority, and most people said that they rely on the legume trade for the majority of their livelihood, and there really wasn't a significant difference between men and women. And then lastly, I just want to mention that we are at GCFSI developing a field-based practicum on what's going on in urban markets in the Lilongwe, and we're approaching it with using something called frugal innovation, and we're going to be working with students on this concept of frugal innovation, which recognizes the potential in sort of the bottom of the pyramid is how it's framed. The bottom of the pyramid people are the people who maybe are the greatest majority of the population, but who may not have a whole lot of input into decision making, or into innovations, or into the way that cities are developed. And so what we would like to do is host some students, or bring some students and collaborate with students at Nuanar in trying to elicit some of those frugal innovations, some of those bottom of the pyramid innovations, and how markets can be improved. And that is not finalized yet, and so and I will have more information on that later going forward. Okay, and here's my contact information if anybody wants to get in touch with me. Thank you for your time today, and we can have more of a discussion now. Thanks.